Hello, my name is Clara and I'm a postdoc in the European project PROTECT. And today I want to present the results that we have just submitted to the cryosphere and that might or might not already be published as a discussion paper by the time you see this video. It is about assessing the basal melt parameterizations for Antarctic ice shelves. So why are we interested in the subshelf melt? Ice sheet models need the information about ocean-induced melt at the base of the ice shelves to force the evolution of the Antarctic ice sheet and therefore simulate the Antarctic contribution to sea level rise, for example. On the other hand, ocean models need the information about the melt as it affects the water properties inside the ice shelf cavity, but also outside. In both cases, the problem is that subshelf cavities are typically not resolved in ocean or coupled climate models, which means that the link between the open ocean and the ocean ice sheet interface is missing. To remedy this problem, basal melt parameterizations have been developed to bridge the gap between the open ocean and the ocean ice interface. For example, simple formulations have been suggested where the melt rate is either a linear or quadratic function of the thermal forcing, where the thermal forcing is the difference between the water temperature and the freezing temperature. And then with time, also more complex parameterizations have been suggested. For example, the box model, also well known as the PICO model, which mimics the overturning circulation in the ice shelf cavity by dividing the path of the meltwater along the ocean ice interface into different boxes. Then we have the plume parameterizations, which assumes that the melt at the grounding line initiates the formation of a freshwater buoyant plume that rises along the ice ocean interface and therefore also leads to melt on the way. And then we have the PICO parameterization, which is a mix between the box model and the plume parameterization, where the temperature and salinity are inferred from the box model, but the melt is computed through the plume parameterization. All these parameterizations take some sort of information about the ocean temperature and salinity in front of the cavity and result in 2D fields of the melt rates below the ice shelf. However, the evaluation of these parameterizations is challenging. If we want to evaluate them with observations, the problem is that in situ observations of the input oceanic properties are sparse in time and space. So the risk is that we tune towards a given ice shelf or a given time period. And the satellite estimates of melt rates remain uncertain. Additionally, if we use both these estimates for the tuning, possible temporal mismatch between the two exists. Instead, one can use models. For example, an assessment has been done in an idealized coupled ocean ice sheet model simulation in 2019, but they only used one idealized ice shelf. And when the recommendations were applied to several Antarctic ice shelves, empirical corrections were needed to get the right present-day melt rates under these individual ice shelves. So our goal with our study is to assess and retune the existing basal melt parameterizations, but this time really for a circum-Antarctic application. And how do we do this? So as I said, we don't necessarily have the observations to do that. So we use a perfect model approach where we use circum-Antarctic ocean simulations that resolve the cavities. And this is then our virtual reality in which we can tune the parameters in the parameterizations in a self-consistent context, which means that the input ocean temperature and salinity really matches the target or the melt rates at the ocean ice interface. To do so, we have an ensemble of 4 NEMO global ocean simulations that were conducted for another European project on a E-Orca 025 grid for in total 127 simulation years, which means that we can also assess their performance on the temporal variability. NEMO resolves the 36 largest cavities that are shown in the map above, and the melt at the ice-ocean interface, or more precisely, the circulation of the water in the cavity and the resulting melt. So to retune the parameterizations, we compute mean profiles averaged over a given domain in front of the ice shelf. And these are ocean temperature and salinity profiles from the NEMO simulations. Then we put them into the melt parameterization, and we minimize the RMSE between the computed melt rates from the parameterization and the target melt rates from the NEMO simulation. And we do this not for every point, but we compute always the integrated melt over the 36 ice shelf and 127 years. Yes. So as a result, this gives us a lot of new parameters for the different parameterizations, especially because we also looked at different variations of the parameterizations. So in total, we have 15 variations, also tuned for different domains, which I will go into directly. I just, before we go into the results of the assessment, I just want to guide you to the different experiments that we did so that you can follow the results. So first, I want to quickly get into the parameters that we tuned. So for the simple parameterizations, we only tune one parameter, which is related to the turbulent heat exchange. For the plume and the pickup parameterization, we tune two parameters. One is the center number, which is also related to the turbulent heat exchange, and the other is related to the entrainment of the plume. And in the box parameterization, we tune one parameter also related to the turbulent heat exchange and one parameter related to the overturning circulation. Then, as I said, the input is a temperature and salinity profile averaged over a given region in front of the ice shelf. And we made two experiments to assess these two different types of input. So one, which we call 50 kilometers, which is that the temperature and salinity profiles are averaged over a domain of 50 kilometers in front of the ice shelf and over the continental shelf. So it's really local. And then the other one is over the offshore, is over a much larger region. And we take only the offshore point, so not over the continental shelf, to mimic possible input from models with coarse resolution that do not resolve the continental shelf. Then for the simple parameterization, we have quite different variations that also result in different results. So that's why I quickly just want to introduce you to them. So for in the quadratic parameterization, there is the possibility to give information about the slope. And so we can define the slope in different ways. One would be to just assume a constant Antarctic slope. One would be to assume a cavity slope, so one slope per ice shelf. And one would be really to assume a local slope on the grid cell level. And then also quadratic can be defined in two ways. So in the local case, it's really, we take the local thermal forcing squared. And in the semi-local case, it is the local thermal forcing multiplied by an average thermal forcing over the cavity. For the plume parameterizations, we look at two variations, the formulation proposed by Lazaroms et al. 2019, and then a modified version that we describe more in details in the manuscript. For the box parameterization, as I said, the domain is divided in different amount of boxes, and we look at dividing the domain in 2 boxes, 5 boxes, and 10 boxes, and the PICO boxes, which are the recommendations from the original PICO paper. And finally, for the pickup, we could have also looked at the same box amounts as the box parameterizations, but we decided to focus only on the PICO boxes because this is what the original version of the paper does, and the 10 boxes because this is the lowest RMSE that resulted from the box parameterizations. Okay, so as you see, we have many different variations, And then so now we retune the parameterizations, and in the next step, we really assess the performance. So if we compare the performance between the integrated shelf melt using the continental shelf input compared to the offshore input, the first thing that comes to our eyes is that the RMSE is lower if we take the more local over the continental shelf input than the offshore input, which is logical because it takes into account shelf dynamics and so on. And so what you can take away from this figure is that for the input over the continental shelf, the lowest RMSE are reached for the quadratic parameterization using an Antarctic or local slope, and for the plume parameterization. While for the offshore, the box parameterization and the quadratic parameterization using a cavity slope lead to the comparably lower RMSE. But if you look at it closely, you see that the RMSE is generally higher by 10 to 40 gigaton per year. And if we look at the mean reference integrated ice shelf melt, which is 38 gigaton per year, then in both cases, the RMSE is still very high. Then for ice sheet modelers, the spatial pattern is very important as well. I thought maybe for ocean modelers less, so we won't go into the detail of the evaluation of the spatial patterns, but still I want to show you one metric that we use to assess the performance on the spatial scale, which is the melt rate near the grounding line. So we took a box near the grounding line of each ice shelf, and then we averaged over time and space to really get the mean pattern. And what you can see is that not the same parameterizations perform well on the ice shelf level and near the grounding line, but also if we really look at it closely, all parameterizations have similar RMSE near the grounding line, except the quadratic using the local slope, which is way off. But again, if we look at the mean reference melt near the grounding line, which is 0.44 meter ice per year, the RMSE exhibited here is still very high. So in the end, if we want to have a best compromise between getting the integrated melt rate and the melt rate near the grounding line right, then we suggest using the quadratic parameterization either in the local or semi-local variant using a constant Antarctic slope, or the two plume parameterization formulations that we presented in the paper. So this was just an overview on the main results that might be interesting really for an application in ocean modeling. But there is more to look forward to in our preprint if you're interested. So we conducted experiments to estimate uncertainty distribution for the tuned parameters. We inferred empirical relationships between the two tunable parameters of the complex parameterizations. And if you're more interested in really the practical side, you can check out our Python package Multimelt, where all the parameterizations are coded. And so as a conclusion, what you should take home from this video is that we use a perfect model approach with an ensemble of circum-Antarctic ocean simulation to retune existing basal melt parameterizations. And that the results show that all parameterizations result in a high RMSE compared to the reference, even after retuning. So there is still work to be done to improve this. If possible, prefer input average over the continental shelf to average over an offshore region. And parameterizations with the lowest RMSE on the integrated ice shelf melt and near the grounding line. So the best compromise are the quadratic formulation using a constant Antarctic slope and the plume parameterization. And with this, thank you if you have survived until the end of this video. I hope that by then also our preprint will be out in the Cryosphere discussion. So if you want more details, you can just check it out with the same title and same co-authors as this talk. And of course, if you want more information, don't hesitate to contact me. I put the contact details on the first slide.